taking.
Well, I've always tried to do as an activist is try and understand what's the base. And a lot of the base, it has to deal with what people are calling for is sovereignty. And so we have to understand the nature of that sovereignty, what it means to be a sovereign nation, how to be a sovereign nation, how it is that we have been denied that recognition and that respect of a sovereign nation. And so you just have to start studying history and understand that's been the nature of our struggle with these Europeans since their arrival. Is them wanting to impose their crown or their government upon us or their constitution. You know, when it comes down to trying to prove that they control all this land and all its resources. So you look at that period of history, that's what Pontiac was about. Pontiac was about preserving the territorial and the sovereign integrity of Native peoples. That comes all the way up to Tecumseh. Tecumseh was about the same thing, which is why he decided to make an arrangement with the British. He thought this was the way to do it. And all of these agreements and these documents and these treaties have been preserved. They're there. All we have to do is look and understand what they say. And then where does that start to change? Well, you come into the 1920s and you've got World War I happening. Following World War I, because of the nature of Native people's involvement in that, and in particular the Six Nations, the Crown of Britain sent a gift of bread and cheese along with a proclamation to Native peoples. And what was dated in that proclamation, which was on Queen Victoria Day, was thanking the Iroquois peoples and the Native peoples for their alliance against Germany in the Great War. And that was very important. They didn't say for our service or for our citizenship. They said for our alliance. And right there is that recognition that we're Native peoples. So after this, you have in 1922 the League of Nations forming in Geneva, Switzerland. The League of Nations was made up of those allies that fought against Germany in that war. So a man named Descahe, he was a Wolf Clan Cayuga, his English name was Levi General, went to Geneva, and he was seeking the seat for the Iroquois Confederacy and for Native peoples on that League of Nations. He had Ireland, Estonia, Panama, and Persia at that time supporting his petition. Mackenzie King, who's then Prime Minister of Canada, finds out about this, sends a letter to the League of Nations stating that Native peoples are outside the competence and jurisdiction of the international body because they are a domestic concern of the government of Canada. Even though other nations were accepting that petition to join the League of Nations with the recognition of the fact that we were allies with Britain. We weren't subjects, we weren't citizens, we were allies. Now, the important thing about that is that when the United Nations forms in 1948, Article 7.1a of their charter says that they cannot interfere in matters of a domestic concern of their member states. And Mackenzie King set that precedent that says we are a domestic concern. So what happens following this now? Descahe was exiled. He could not return to his homeland. He became an expatriate on his own land. The other thing that happened was 1924, I think, was when they sent Colonel Morgan and the RCMP into Six Nations, destroyed, burnt the longhouse, killed a couple of the chiefs, arrested chiefs and clan mothers. This is when Canada confiscates the wampum belts and the records of the Confederacy. They went into Oneida a couple of months later and did the same thing. They then imposed an elected band council system based upon their model on Native peoples. We have a black screen. So after these raids on the Longhouse, the next thing they do is pass legislation which imposes an elective band council system based upon their model on Native peoples across Canada, thereby making our traditional forms of government, our traditional forms of decision making and clan decision making illegal. So this is what we have to understand if we're talking about sovereignty. That sovereignty that can't be taken away. We were sovereign peoples and we still are. And that is only through our own acquiescence that this sovereignty is continued to be denied. And by acquiescence, I mean in allowing, Canada to exert its dominance over us, and allowing Canada to have the power that it has over us. I think we should be calling for forensic accountings on all of the Indian Affairs money that's been coming to Native people since the 1900s. By all accounts, we should be the richest people in this country with all the money that they've been putting into the Indian Affairs. But we have to remember that it's Indian Affairs and Northern Development. And this is where it comes down to, how are they going to get those resources? They have to keep our sovereignty now. If we are allowed to be sovereign or to exert our sovereignty, that means Canada can't benefit from those resources. But this is when that imposition comes in of those band councils. This is when our sovereignty is taken away. Now, the same thing was going on south of the border. In the United States in 1921, they had something go through called the Indian Reorganization Act, which was the same thing. And it's interesting that the United States did it just shortly before Canada did. And the whole thing behind that Indian Reorganization Act was the fact that corporations wanted to start mining the coal and drilling the oil and digging the uranium out of the ground that was on native reserves in the Southwest. But those traditional Indians there weren't signing the leases or allowing them to come on and do their resources. So it was these corporations that began petitioning the federal government, prompting the federal government to go in and to impose the Indian Reorganization Act, establishing electoral band council systems. And oddly enough, the first business of these band councils was to sign the leases. Following that, you got the same thing starting to happen in Canada. And this is where we are now. So we have to understand that this is what we have to go back to and understand. We have to understand that prior to 1958, we were wards of the government. We weren't sovereign peoples. We were wards of the government. And this all came about as a result of these actions in the 1920s. Wards of the government have no rights. It was illegal for our peoples to go to school past the age of 15. It was illegal for Native peoples to receive a post-secondary education. And that didn't change until 1965. So for all those rednecks who keep crying about the fact that Native people get free education, well, that's owed to us. That was denied. That's only been since 1965 that we've been trying to play catch up with them on that educational level. Otherwise, where's all our doctors and lawyers and architects and, we have very few people in those big professions simply because of that. Not that because we're stupid, because that education system was denied. There's a whole generation of us that are suffering from, Stockholm syndrome from that. I refuse to emphasize with my batterer. I refuse to emphasize with my protector. I won't be a victim of Stockholm syndrome or battered wife syndrome. But that education is necessary, but we still have to understand who we are. And that education needs to start benefiting our peoples. But those were the laws that they had to start changing. 1960 was the vote and the right to own business and private property.